Good afternoon. I am George Parasotto, Administrative Director for the California Department of Industrial Relations, Division of Workers' Compensation. Welcome to the Division's educational webinar on the Medical Treatment Utilization Schedule Drug Formulary. We will be posting the slides and recorded webinar on the Division's website for later viewing. Let me first introduce our presenters for today. Dr. Raymond Meister is the Executive Medical Director of the Division of Workers' Compensation. Jacqueline Schauer is an attorney in the DWC Legal Unit and has been working on the formulary rulemaking action. Lucy Shannon is with the Reed Group and is the Director of Editorial Research and Development. The Reed Group is the publisher of the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine Guidelines. Today, we will be providing some information regarding the legislative background to the new workers' compensation drug formulary, and we'll explain how it fits within the larger framework of the medical treatment utilization schedule. Dr. Meister and Jackie Schauer will discuss the details of the MTUS drug list and the ancillary formulary rules. We are happy to have Lucy Shannon of the Reed Group here to demonstrate the very useful features of the online ACOM treatment guidelines and formulary tools. AB 1124, which was signed by Governor Brown on October 6, 2015, requires that the division adopt an evidence-based drug formulary as part of the medical treatment utilization schedule. The MTUS drug formulary is the result of many months of study, consultation with the public, and formal rulemaking to receive public comment. It is important to note that the drug formulary is part of the MTUS. The drug formulary and the MTUS treatment guidelines work together to guide treatment decisions. We are pleased that effective December 1st, 2017, the division has adopted updated treatment guidelines of the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. Dr. Meister will provide an overview of the MTUS and the recent evidence-based updates to the guidelines, which provide the backbone to the drug formulary. Last month, the division presented a webinar focused on the MTUS updates, which is available for viewing on the DWC website. Although some of the material today overlaps with the MTUS webinar, please bear with us, as the formulary is an integral part of the MTUS, and successful implementation is founded upon use of the MTUS treatment guidelines and the MTUS rules. Now, Dr. Meister will provide an overview of the MTUS.
Thanks, George, and hello, everyone. So, what is the MTUS? When most people think of the MTUS, they think of medical treatment guidelines, but it is more than that. It is a set of regulations that provide the clinician with an analytical framework for the evaluation and treatment of injured workers in California's workers' compensation system. It is found within the California Code of Regulations, Title 8, beginning at Section 9792.20. As of January 1st, 2018, the MTUS will also include the regulation sections that constitute the MTUS drug formulary. The MTUS was developed to establish evidence-based, peer-reviewed, nationally recognized standards of care to guide the evaluation and treatment of injured workers. The core of the MTUS is the medical treatment guidelines. So why is the MTUS important? California law requires use of the MTUS treatment guidelines. California Labor Code Section 4600B states, medical treatment that is reasonably required to cure or relieve the injured worker means treatment that is based upon the guidelines adopted by the administrative director. In addition, Labor Code 4604.5A makes it clear that recommendations found in the MTUS guidelines are presumed correct on the issue of extent and scope of medical treatment. The term presumed correct means that recommendations found in the MTUS guidelines will automatically be applied to guide patient care unless the treating physician disagrees with the recommendation and wishes to challenge it. The treatment guidelines are based on a robust literature review and analysis of efficacy and safety to determine which treatments are recommended for the conditions in the guideline. The application of evidence-based medicine through use of the ACOM guidelines is intended to improve patient care. For conditions not covered by the guidelines, or if a guideline recommendation is being challenged, the MTUS is important because it sets forth a scientifically sound method of evaluating medical evidence. The MTUS is important because it is the primary source of guidance for treating physicians and physician reviewers in California's workers' compensation system. The MTUS provides the pathway to providing appropriate patient care and getting treatment requests approved. As of December 1st, 2017, the DWC incorporated by reference the most recent American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine's treatment guidelines. We'll call these the ACOM guidelines. These were incorporated into the MTUS. The new treatment guidelines are effective for all medical services rendered on or after December 1st, 2017. Available in the handouts section is a resources guide with a link to a web page where you can find the Administrative Director's order, which includes the regulatory amendments. Let's look at how the MTUS regulation adopting a medical evidence search sequence guides evidence-based medical treatment decisions. This flowchart graphic illustrates the medical evidence search sequence mandate to always begin by searching in the adopted MTUS guidelines. Now that the DWC has adopted the most recent ACOM guidelines, the patient's injury or condition will most likely be addressed in the ACOM guidelines adopted into the MTUS. Take a look at the yellow flowchart on the right-hand side of the slide. Ask yourself, is the patient's condition or injury addressed by an MTUS guideline? If the answer is yes, then ask yourself, does the recommendation found in the MTUS guideline support the treatment or request or treatment plan? If the care the doctor wishes to provide is supported by the MTUS guidelines, then simply apply the MTUS guideline recommendation to the treatment of your patient. There's no mystery here. In fact, it can be a very simple process. However, let me emphasize, without proper documentation, your request for authorization, or RFA, can still be denied even if you've followed this process. Proper documentation is the key to approval. Before we turn to the use of recommendations found outside of the MTUS guidelines, take a look at the second blue box, which states, search in the most current ACOM guidelines or official disability guidelines. You may ask yourself, why would I need to search the most current ACOM guidelines when I already did that in step 1, the top blue box? Here's the difference. An ACOM guideline is not yet part of the MTUS until the DWC formally adopts it. Currently, all of the MTUS guidelines are ACOM guidelines. However, there may be ACOM guidelines that have not been adopted into the MTUS. For example, the traumatic brain injury guideline was just published by ACOM, but the DWC has not yet adopted it into the MTUS. Until we do so, the traumatic brain injury guideline is not considered an MTUS guideline. Okay, we now turn to the use of recommendations found outside of the MTUS guidelines for patient treatment. Here is a slide that shows the medical evidence search sequence again, but this time the treating provider is searching for treatment recommendations outside of the MTUS guidelines. There are only 2 limited situations that may warrant treatment based on recommendations found outside of the MTUS guidelines. Take a look at the red box on the right-hand side of the slide. The first situation is when the patient's medical condition is not addressed in the MTUS guidelines. The physician should continue through the search sequence to find evidence-based approaches to care. The second situation is when the patient's medical condition is addressed in the MTUS guidelines, but the recommendations do not support the physician's desired treatment plan. Recommendations found in the MTUS guidelines are presumed correct. So, if a doctor disagrees with these recommendations, he or she may challenge them by finding recommendations outside of the MTUS that are supported with a higher level of evidence. The treating physician bears the burden of proving the medical necessity of treatment requests when challenging the adopted treatment guidelines. In both situations, the physician will need to find recommendations outside of the MTUS guidelines that support the treatment plan. In order for the treatment plan to be approved, the recommendation must be supported by the best available evidence. You may be wondering why this webinar on the formulary is discussing the MTUS treatment guidelines in such depth. It is important to understand that the MTUS formulary is a component of the medical treatment utilization schedule. The regulations define the MTUS drug formulary to include the MTUS drug list and formulary rules. In addition, the formulary rules make it clear that the MTUS regulations, including the medical evidence search sequence and the MTUS methodology for evaluating medical evidence, are applicable to determine the medical necessity of pharmaceutical treatment. We can think of the MTUS drug formulary as having three essential parts. Number one, the ACOM treatment guidelines, which are the backbone to the formulary. Number two, the MTUS drug list, which guides prospective review requirements. And third, the ancillary formulary rules. The MTUS drug list is not a standalone document. It must be used in conjunction with the adopted ACOM treatment guidelines, which are presumed correct on the scope of medical treatment. For conditions not covered by the MTUS guidelines, or if the physician challenges the treatment recommendation in the ACOM guidelines, the MTUS medical search sequence illustrated in the previous slide is applicable and guides the selection of evidence-based pharmaceutical treatment. The MTUS drug formulary regulations were approved by the Office of Administrative Law and filed with the Secretary of State on December 7, 2017. The regulations become effective on January 1st, 2018. The MTUS drug formulary will apply to drugs dispensed on or after January 1st, 2018, regardless of the date of injury. However, for injured workers who are receiving an ongoing course of treatment with a non-exempt drug, an unlisted drug, or a compounded drug, there is a regulation addressing the physician's duty to submit an updated treatment plan so that there is a phased implementation of the formulary as guided by newly adopted ACOM treatment guidelines. The MTUS drug formulary applies to drugs dispensed for outpatient use at home or outside of a clinical setting. The MTUS drug formulary does not apply to physician-administered drugs. However, it should be noted that physician-administered drugs are often subject to the ACOM treatment guidelines adopted in the MTUS. For example, recommendations for the use of steroid injections into a joint. Now let's examine the MTUS drug list, which is adopted into the formulary regulations. This slide shows the first page of the drug list. The list is posted on the DWC website in both PDF and Excel formats. At the top of the MTUS drug list is a condensed narrative overview of ancillary formulary rules such as physician dispensing rule, generic versus brand rule, and special fill and perioperative fill policies. Looking at the headings, we can see that the drug list is organized by active drug ingredient, lists a reference brand name for most of the drugs, designates the exempt or non-exempt status for each drug. It designates drugs which are eligible for the special fill and perioperative fill by including a number of days supply entry. The drug class is listed. The reference and guidelines column lists the ACOM treatment guidelines adopted into the MTUS that address the drug, and each entry includes a symbol to indicate the type of ACOM recommendations that are found in each guideline. We will discuss this column in greater detail shortly. The last three columns with the headings dosage form, strength, and unique pharmaceutical identifier currently do not have data. They are reserved for future use, and the division intends to consult with the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee on using these columns to enhance the usefulness of the drug list. All of the drugs contained in the MTUS drug list are drugs that are addressed by the ACOM treatment guidelines that have been adopted into the MTUS. The MTUS drug list is not a standalone document and must be used in conjunction with the ACOM treatment guidelines adopted into the MTUS. Later in the presentation, Lucy Shannon of the Reed Group will be demonstrating the ACOM guidelines and formulary tool and will explain how to obtain a license from the Reed Group. Next, we will examine some important features of the MTUS drug list in greater depth. To assist in the provision of timely care and with a focus on the critical acute phase of treatment, we have designated certain medications as exempt drugs on the MTUS drug list. Criteria considered in designating a drug as exempt are listed on this slide. In short, exempt drugs are those that are generally safe and effective in the treatment of the acute phase of common work-related injuries and illnesses. Exempt drug status should be of benefit to providers and their patients in that these medications will be provided to the injured worker with no prospective review as long as they are ordered in accord with the recommendations of the MTUS guidelines. However, the physician dispensing rule and brand drug rule need to be consulted for drugs otherwise designated as exempt. Let me note here that there may certainly be situations where a non-exempt drug will be appropriate and will be supported by the guidelines. Now let's take a deeper look at the reference and guidelines column. This column indicates which ACOM guidelines address the drug. Taking the example of acetaminophen, we see that 10 different guidelines address the medical evidence for use of acetaminophen. The reference and guideline column cannot be used on its own. It must be used in conjunction with the underlying ACOM guideline adopted in the MTUS. This column is intended to be a quick reference for determining which guideline topics should be consulted for a particular disorder or condition. The legend for the symbols is set forth in the narrative information at the top of the MTUS drug list. We have enlarged them here. These symbols indicate which types of evidence-based recommendations are contained in each guideline. Recommended means that the drug has sufficient evidence-based support to use the drug for one or more conditions in the guideline. Not recommended means that the medical evidence is sufficient to have a recommendation against use of the drug for one or more conditions in the guideline. And no recommendation means there is not sufficient evidence for a recommendation for or against use of the drug for one or more conditions covered in the guideline. But again, you have to go to the applicable guideline and review the entire recommendation to properly use a medication on the MTUS drug list. Let's look at the example of the entry for acetaminophen on the MTUS drug list. It is listed as exempt. This means it is exempt from prospective utilization review as long as its use is consistent with the ACOM guideline adopted in the MTUS. The reference and guideline column shows 10 guidelines have evidence-based references for use of acetaminophen. Each guideline addresses many different types of conditions or injuries, and acetaminophen may have evidence of benefit for some, but not all of the conditions. If we look at the elbow disorders chapter, we would see that there are many conditions are covered, including ulnar neuropathy at the elbow. Based on the evidence reviews, the guidelines contain recommendations on whether to use acetaminophen to treat these conditions, which may depend on the phase of care. Let's look at a few screenshots from the MD Guidelines website to illustrate some of these points. First, here is what you would see if you searched for the use of acetaminophen within the elbow disorders chapter for the condition of ulnar neuropathy at the elbow. This screenshot shows that there are times that acetaminophen is recommended and other times that it is not recommended for the treatment of the same condition. And remember this slide, because in a couple of slides I'm going to go dig deeper into the recommendation, and you'll see why there can be both a recommendation and a not recommended for the same conditions. In this slide, I have expanded the information available on the yes recommendation. And you'll notice that there are comments for both the prescriber and the claims professional here. And in this third screenshot, I have provided the actual ACOM treatment guideline recommendations regarding acetaminophen use in ulnar neuropathy at the elbow. And this is ultimately what the healthcare provider should be relying upon to make their treatment decisions. And as was noted a couple of slides earlier, it said that there was more indications that acetaminophen was both recommended and not recommended for this condition. And if you read this recommendation in a little more depth, you'll see that it is not recommended as a primary treatment for acute, subacute, or chronic ulnar neuropathies at the elbow. But if you have someone who has had surgery for that condition and is in the post-surgical period, then it is recommended. So again, while the symbols may at first seem confusing, if one goes to the recommendation, it should be clear there. Now let's take a look at what the designation of non-exempt means. In short, non-exempt drugs are those medications that are generally used in the chronic phase of care or have more risks associated with their use or are used for less common work-related injuries and illnesses. Drugs listed as non-exempt are covered in the ACOM treatment guidelines, and users may obtain guidance and recommendations there. Let me emphasize that this formulary does not deny access to any FDA-approved drug. All non-exempt and any unlisted medications are available if medically necessary and approved through the usual prospective review process. Let me also note here that there may certainly be situations where a non-exempt drug will be appropriate for the patient and supported by the guidelines. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking specifically about opioid medications. All of us have probably seen these disturbing headlines which have been so prevalent over the last several years. Let me show you a screenshot from the ACOM Opioids Treatment Guideline. This is the recommendation on the use of opioids for acute pain. Let me zoom in on the last paragraph of this recommendation. Let me read this from the ACOM opioid guideline. Long-term opioid use often begins with treatment of acute pain. When opioids are used for acute pain, clinicians should prescribe the lowest effective dose of immediate release opioids and should prescribe no greater quantity than needed for the expected duration of pain severe enough to require opioids. 3 days or less will often be sufficient. more than 7 days will rarely be needed. As noted in the ACOM guideline quoted here, the Centers for Disease Control has found that 3 days or less of opioid use is often sufficient. The CDC recommendation I mentioned on the previous slide was published in 2016. In 2017, the CDC released new findings as noted on this slide. They found that in patients being treated for acute pain who were not previously using opioids, that the risk of still being on opioids a year later started increasing with the 3rd day of opioid use, with a sharp increase on the 5th day. In light of these findings and consistent with opioid use recommendations, the MTUS formulary allows the urgent provision of appropriate opioids for severe acute pain without prospective review, but limits the supply to a maximum of 4 days unless authorization is obtained. This special fill provision of the MTUS formulary will be discussed in more detail later in this webinar. And for that discussion and additional information on the MTUS formulary rules, I'll now turn the presentation over to my DWC colleague, Jackie Schauer.
Thank you, Dr. Meister. I'm going to be discussing some of the ancillary rules that work in conjunction with the MTUS guidelines and the MTUS drug list. First, we will look at the rule regarding the use of brand name drugs and generic drugs. Both brand name drugs and generic drugs are available to treat the injured worker. Labor Code Section 4600.1 currently requires that a generic be dispensed unless the physician specifies the brand name drug must be dispensed. As of January 1, 2018, the formulary regulation will govern the issue of generic versus brand instead of Labor Code Section 4600.1. The formulary regulations adopt a preference for generic drugs where the brand name drug is more expensive than the generic equivalent. A doctor can write a prescription for a brand name drug and specify that it must be dispensed as written or no substitution. However, if there is a less costly therapeutic equivalent, the doctor must substantiate the medical necessity of the more costly brand name drug, including the patient-specific factors that support the need for the brand that could not be met by the generic therapeutic equivalent. The determination of whether the brand and the generic are therapeutic equivalents is based upon the Food and Drug Administration's determination that the two drugs are assigned a therapeutic equivalence evaluation code beginning with the letter A. These therapeutic equivalence codes are set forth in the FDA's publication called the Orange Book. The formulary regulations adopt a policy that we call special fill. Under this policy, designated non-exempt drugs may be dispensed without prospective review if they meet the criteria. In order to be eligible for the special fill, the drug must be designated as special fill eligible on the MTUS drug list. The drug must be prescribed at the single initial treatment visit, which occurs within 7 days of the date of injury. The supply of the drug must not exceed the number of days supply listed on the MTUS drug list. And the drug dispensed must be the generic drug if a generic version exists and is less expensive than the brand name drug. However, where a doctor prescribes a more expensive brand name drug and indicates that no substitutions are allowed, he or she must document the medical necessity for the brand name drug rather than the generic drug. The doctor must specify patient-specific factors that support the medical necessity for the brand name drug. Let's look at a snip of the MTUS drug list showing the entry for baclofen, a muscle relaxant. We can see that it is designated as a special fill drug by looking at the special fill column of the MTUS drug list. The special fill column indicates that a 4-day supply of baclofen is eligible for the special fill. The reference and guidelines column indicates which ACOM treatment guidelines adopted in the MTUS address baclofen. We can see that 5 of the guidelines have yes recommendations for use of baclofen. The physician will need to review the relevant guideline to see the recommendations for use of baclofen in light of the patient's specific condition. The MD Guidelines ACOM Formulary tool will allow users to search by drug name and see recommendations for use of the drug by condition, pain severity, and phase of care. The Excel format of the MTUS drug list is useful as it can be sorted by the various columns so that someone wanting to see all the special fill eligible drugs can easily sort the list by that field. The special fill drugs include selected muscle relaxants, corticosteroids, and opioid analgesics. These drugs have a higher risk profile than many other medications, but may be urgently needed and therefore will not require prospective authorization when the special fill criteria are met. Currently, all of the special fill drugs are specified for a 4-day supply. If the patient needs a longer course of treatment, the physician should obtain authorization, which can be requested on an expedited basis if expedited review is warranted by the injured worker's condition. The perioperative fill policy adopted in the formulary regulations is similar to the special fill policy and covers designated non-exempt drugs. In order to be eligible for the perioperative fill, the drug must meet the following criteria. The drug must be designated as perioperative fill eligible on the MTUS drug list. The drug must be prescribed during the perioperative period, which the regulations define as 4 days before surgery to 4 days after surgery. The supply of the drug must not exceed the number of days supply listed on the MTUS drug list. The drug dispensed must be the generic drug if a generic version exists and is less expensive than the brand name drug. However, where a doctor prescribes a more expensive brand name drug and indicates that no substitutions are allowed, he or she must document the medical necessity of the brand name drug. Let's look at a snip of the MTUS drug list showing the entry for warfarin sodium, an anticoagulant. We can see that it is designated as a perioperative fill drug by looking at the perioperative fill column of the MTUS drug list. The perioperative fill column indicates that a 14-day supply of warfarin sodium is eligible for the perioperative fill. The reference and guidelines column indicates which ACOM treatment guidelines adopted into the MTUS address the use of warfarin sodium. We can see that 3 of the ACOM guidelines address use of warfarin sodium. The hip and groin disorders guideline and the knee disorders guideline both contain 1 or more recommendations supporting use of the drug. The physician will need to consult the guideline to determine which conditions are addressed and see the detailed recommendations for use. The Read Group's formulary tool will allow users to search by drug name and see recommendations for use of the drug by condition, pain severity, and phase of care. The Excel format of the MTUS drug list is useful as it can be sorted by the various columns so that someone wanting to see all of the perioperative fill eligible drugs can easily sort it by that field. The perioperative fill drugs include selected anticoagulants, opioid analgesics, a muscle relaxant, and an anticonvulsant. Where a surgery is scheduled and not performed on an emergency basis, the physician should obtain prospective authorization for the surgery and for the related medications. However, the perioperative fill is available to provide medications where needed for appropriate patient care. For example, there may be an unexpected need for perioperative medication or a need to change a medication if the patient has had an adverse reaction to a previously authorized drug. One of the ancillary formulary rules governs the physician dispensing of pharmaceuticals. The division is aware that physician dispensing can be convenient for the patient, and we recognize that the Business and Professions Code allows a doctor to dispense drugs to patients for conditions the doctor is treating. However, research has shown that physician dispensing may sometimes be influenced by financial incentives. In order to strike a balance between patient convenience and assuring medical necessity of drug treatment, the formulary rules require authorization through prospective review before physician dispensing of a drug except as set forth in the regulations. There are 3 exceptions to the requirement for prospective review before the physician dispenses the drug. First, exempt drugs may be dispensed without prospective review if the drug is dispensed at the initial visit and is dispensed within 7 days of the date of injury. Use of the drug must be in accordance with the MTUS treatment guidelines. The second and third exceptions are where the physician is dispensing the drug under the special fill policy or the perioperative fill policy. Another important part of the regulation is the provision that recognizes that physician dispensing may be restricted pursuant to a medical provider network agreement or a pharmacy benefit contract pursuant to Labor Code Section 4600.2. In workers' compensation, the employer is required to provide reasonable and necessary medical treatment to cure or relieve the employee of the effects of the injury. For pharmaceutical treatment, this can be done through pharmacy dispensed medication. The formulary regulations require that a compounded drug be authorized through prospective review before it is dispensed to the injured worker. In order to obtain authorization, the physician must document the medical necessity and include patient-specific factors that require use of a compounded medication instead of a drug approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Some examples of situations that may warrant use of a compounded drug are a patient with an allergy to a dye or filler contained in the FDA-approved drug, or a patient who cannot swallow a pill and needs a liquid form of a drug that is not available in that dosage form in an FDA-approved product. The FDA approval process is intended to ensure safety and efficacy of drugs. Compounded drugs do not go through an FDA approval process. Assembly Bill 1124 directed the division to provide guidance regarding how an injured worker may access off-label use of prescription drugs when evidence-based and medically necessary. The formulary regulations implement this directive by tying the off-label use into the treatment guidelines and the usual MTUS method for supporting treatment outside of the guidelines. What is off-label use? The formulary regulations have a definition which states that off-label use means use of a drug for a condition or in a dosage or method of administration not listed in the drug's FDA-approved labeling for approved use. Since the expressed legislative intent is that the off-label use be evidence-based and medically necessary, the regulations provide that off-label use of exempt medications do not require prospective review if the off-label use is supported by the MTUS treatment guidelines. For non-exempt drugs or unlisted drugs, off-label use requires prospective review, and the medical necessity will be governed by the usual rules, including the MTUS medical evidence search sequence, the quality and strength of evidence definitions, and the methodology for evaluating medical evidence. There are several other regulatory provisions that we would like to discuss briefly. One of the regulations is entitled Waiver of Prospective Review. This section provides the prospective review may be waived where a utilization review plan adopts a prior authorization program pursuant to the utilization review regulations in section 9792.7 subdivision A5. Another regulation section clarifies that the drug's formulary does not relieve the employer of obligations to provide treatment under the California Health and Safety regulations, such as the Cal-OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard. Another formulary regulation states that the DWC may maintain and post a listing of the MTUS drug list by National Drug Code, RxCUI maintained by the National Library of Medicine, or other unique pharmaceutical identifier. The division will be considering the usefulness of adopting such a list and intends to seek input from the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee. The regulations specify that updates to the MTUS drug list will be made at least quarterly and will be adopted by an administrative director order, which will be posted to the DWC webpage. The formulary regulations also address the composition, role, and function of the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee. There will be quarterly meetings open to the public, chaired by the DWC Medical Director. The role of the P&T Committee is to provide advice to the Administrative Director on updates to the formulary. The P&T Committee will be composed of 3 physicians, medical doctors, and doctors of osteopathy, and 3 pharmacists. DWC is now accepting applications to serve on the committee. The application form to use and a conflict of interest disclosure form are posted on the DWC website. Now we are going to look at an important regulation relating to transition plans. Assembly Bill 1124 specifies that there should be a phased implementation for injuries prior to the effective date of the formulary. This is accomplished by adopting a rule that specifically addresses workers injured before January 1, 2018 who are on an ongoing course of drug treatment. We want to emphasize that the adoption of the formulary does not mean that all injured workers need to be transitioned to exempt drugs. A non-exempt drug or an unlisted drug or a compounded drug could be appropriate for the injured worker's condition. It is important that the treating physician review the injured worker's treatment plan, looking at the guidance in the applicable adopted ACOM treatment guidelines, or consider other evidence-based guidelines or studies if the condition is not covered in the ACOM guidelines. The formulary regulations refer to the usual reporting format to present the physician's treatment plan, which is the progress report, or PR2, required by 9785 of the regulations. Doctors are required by Section 9785 to submit a PR2 no less frequently than every 45 days during ongoing treatment. Ideally, the treating physician will submit the transition plan along with the request for authorization at the next PR2 due date. But if that is not feasible, the regulations allow the report, treatment plan, and RFA to be submitted by April 1, 2018. Next, we have a slide that contains information on obtaining a license from the READ group for commercial users of the ACOM guidelines and formulary and the MTUS drug list. READ group is offering a special discounted price for new California medical provider subscribers. The web page link is set forth on the slide. Persons and entities who are not medical providers should contact Joe Guerriero of the READ group to obtain a license. His contact information is on the slide. Now I am pleased to introduce Lucy Shannon, Director of Editorial Research and Development at the READ group. She will demonstrate use of the ACOM guidelines and formulary tool.
Thank you so much, Jackie and Dr. Meister. Whilst we're getting set up, and it looks like we're just about ready for me to take over, I am Lucy Shannon. I'm happy to be here today. I am the Director of Editorial Research and Development for READ Group. And in this role, I'm responsible for the content that we'll be looking at today, as well as developing tools to deliver that content to our users, making it easier to find what you're looking for. This is the main page of the MD Guidelines website. So from here, as Ray and Jackie mentioned, users do need to have a subscription to the site. So when I have that, I click on that login button, and bear with me for a moment here while I get myself logged in. So this is the page that our users see once they've actually logged into the site. And from here, all of our users have access to all of the content. For today's demonstration purposes, I am going to be focusing on the California MTUS, or the ACOM practice guidelines, as well as a couple of tools that we deliver that recommendation through. So both DART, which stands for Diagnosis and Related Treatments, and we'll also take a look at the formulary today. We're going to start over here on the right-hand side of the page, where there is access to resources. And when I click on that, a drop-down menu appears for me. And the second item available on that menu is the ACOM practice guidelines. However, right below that is a link to state guidelines. And if our users in this session were to click on that, the first entry that they would see would be for the California MTUS. And when I enter this area, now I have access to all of the disorder guidelines that have been adopted by the state of California. This list matches exactly had I gone to the ACOM practice guidelines in that resources menu. the one difference, and Dr. Meister did mention this, is that there would be an additional entry on that page at the very bottom for our brand new guideline, which is for traumatic brain injury. So because we didn't want to confuse anyone, we did create this California MTUS page. We do plan on providing access to the California MTUS drug list on this page as well. So that will be something that will be coming in the next days, and we will be posting that. And it'll say, it'll have some language with it to let our users know that it's proposed, and when it is effective, we'll remove that language. So you can look for that in the days ahead. So when a user comes in here, I want to show you how you would go about looking for information in the guidelines. And again, we're going to focus on medication information. So for today's demo, I'm going to go ahead and open up the low back disorders guideline. And right at the top of the guideline is a link for summary of recommendations. When users open that, then we are presented with a table with links to all of the recommendations that are in this particular guideline. So for example, if I'm looking for information on anticonvulsants, then I'm able to come right here. I can go ahead and click on the entry that I'm looking for. And then it's taken me right into the page where the recommendation I'm looking for resides. So I can either scroll through this page, or I could go ahead and do a Control F, and in this case, I'm going to go ahead and start, oops, let's see, I'm going to start typing in topiramate, and it takes me to the place in the guideline where that particular wording is. And the recommendation that I had clicked on, this is the particular one. I am going to scroll up here because I want to make an important point. So in the guidelines, there are cases where a specific medication is actually called out by name. So we've just looked at one for topiramate, gabapentin. So there are very specific medications. However, there are also lots of instances when those specific medications are not called out by name. We just have the class of medications. So I want to make it really clear that as you're looking for information and you're not able to find, in the full-length guideline an exact match for a medication, it could be that it's because it was listed under a drug class and not that specific medication. So that's how I would navigate into the guidelines. So in summary, we got here by going to the summary of recommendations table, and then it took me right into the guideline. I did a Control F on the page to find the text that I was looking for. Now, across the top of the page is what we call breadcrumbs, and what these tell me are exactly where I've navigated to within this guideline. So although I used a link, I know that I was in low back disorders, diagnostic and treatment recommendations, low back pain, the treatment recommendations for low back pain, and finally the medications category. So I am going to go back out to that initial table of contents that we saw, and I'm going to show you how to do that without using that summary of recommendations. So again, I'm interested in medication, so looking at all of these available options to me, I know that that's a treatment option, or I'm sorry, a treatment recommendation, and that it was for low back pain. Again, I'm looking for treatment recommendations and a medication. And then here we go, right back to the place in the page that I had just been showing you. And then again, the breadcrumbs across the top of the page help me to understand where I am. So this is to show you how to navigate through the full-length guideline. We have created tools to bring these recommendations to your fingertips, and that's through the tool called DART. So I am going to go ahead and click on DART. This particular tool can be accessed on any page that you're on in the website. It persists on this global toolbar across the top of the page. When I click on it, I do need to indicate the condition that I'm treating. So in this case, we're going to stick with that low back pain. And as I start to type in, it is based on predictive text, so it starts to give me some options. And then the next filter that I have is regarding the category. So I'm going to drop this down. These are all of the different categories that recommendations exist for the topic of low back pain. And if I don't know where the recommendation resides, so for example, if I was looking for something like acupuncture and I'm not exactly sure where that is in these categories, I don't actually have to make a selection. I could leave that as any, and I could go ahead and close out of here, and then I get a full list of the recommendations, and I can get to acupuncture that way. Again, today we're going to focus on medications, so I am going to go ahead and click on that medications category. The next filter is regarding the phase. I have the choice of acute, subacute, chronic, and I do have a tab for surgical, and this would provide me recommendations that are specific to the pre, peri, and post-operative periods. Again, I don't have to make a selection here. So I'm going to go ahead and click Go. And now all of the recommendations for medications are available, and I can scroll through the list, or in this case, I could start to type in what I was looking for, and here we go. I have the recommendation is available for me here through DART. So it's the same text that we had been looking for. If I were to click on, well, let me just show you what's available. I'm sorry. So this lets me know that this recommendation is appropriate for chronic low back pain. I'm provided with a recommendation summary, the level of confidence, indications, information on the frequency, dose, and duration, harms, benefits, indications for discontinuation, the rationale supporting this recommendation, evidence summary, and then some additional comments. So if I were to click on More, I'm taken to a brand new tab, and I can scroll through and see the full-length text available for this particular recommendation. There's also a link here to the evidence tables. So in this case, I can see that we have 1 high quality and 2 moderate quality randomized controlled trials that are supporting this particular recommendation. And if I click on this See Evidence table, then again a new tab opens, and all of the evidence along with the score that it received and a brief summary is available to me in this view. I am going to back out of here, and a couple of things that I want to point out before I leave the START tool. As I mentioned from the beginning, users right now have to enter in the name of the topic that they're looking for. We are going to be adding functionality that allows you to come in with the treatment that you're looking for. So if that treatment, again, I'll use that example of acupuncture. If I'm looking for information on acupuncture or physical therapy, I could go ahead and enter that into the treatment box, and then it's going to help me get at that information. The other thing that we are adding is a link from the recommendation to the full-length guideline itself. So just like we use the link in the summary of recommendations table, We will be providing a link from every recommendation that will take you into the full-length guidelines so that you can read that recommendation in the context of the full guideline. So those additional functionality will be released, some in December and some in January, so definitely look for that to come soon. Next, we're going to take a look at the formulary. So the formulary, again, is condition-specific, and when a user comes to the formulary, they do need to let us know what condition is being treated. So in this case, I'm going to stick with that low back pain, and when I click go, the results that are going to be provided look very similar to the results that are returned in the DART tool. So from here, I can make you know, some filtering selections. So I could indicate that I'm just interested in chronic. I could indicate that I just want to look at anticonvulsants. I could also just start typing in the name of the drug that I'm looking for, so I actually don't have to put anything in. I could just start typing that drug name, and now I have access to the recommendations. So another way to get at this, and when I open this up, it gives me comments for the prescriber, comments for the claims professional, codes that I would anticipate being associated with this condition, average estimated cost, and then a static link down here. And we are going back through and changing these to live URLs. So again, the live URL will take you into the full-length guideline where you'll be able to access the recommendation that is supporting this entry in the formulary. There is another way to get at information in our formulary, and that is to search directly by the drug. So if I am interested in looking at, I'm going to enter Percocet, and click go. This is kind of a back door into the content. So I still need to indicate the condition that's being treated, but in this case, I can see all of the different guidelines that this drug is mentioned in. And for low back disorders, I can see and open up this particular recommendation. The comments here for the claims or for the prescriber, a lot of information is being provided, including indications for initiating opioid therapy. And as I, again, get down to the bottom of this, it has those static links. The first is would be a link to the low back pain disorder guideline, and then there's additional information that's coming from the opioids guideline. So again, we'll be making sure that those links will take the users back into the full-length content. So this is where, when Dr. Meister was talking about how the formulary and the guidelines need to be used in conjunction, you can start to see that although on that MTUS drug list, this particular medication, and I believe all opioids are listed as non-exempt, there are conditions where that medication is going to be warranted, and the support for that prescription is going to be able to be backed up in the guidelines. So with that, we've run out of time. By coming up here to the left-hand side of the screen, this MD Guidelines logo, whenever I click on that logo, it takes me back to that home page or that landing page of the guideline that you'll see once you've logged into the website. At this point, I am going to turn it back over to the DWC so that we can conclude for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, for the presentation. We appreciate your demonstration of the MD Guidelines ACOM tools. We've compiled a list of useful resources related to the MTUS and the formulary. We have them on a slide, and the links will also be posted on our DWC website. And thank you for attending today's webinar on the MTUS drug formulary. The recorded formulary webinar and slides will be posted on the DWC website for later viewing. This concludes today's webinar.